cool with Jody, and I used to go there at my wedding. Such a tragedy. What can you do?
I'm so sorry. We will do the Shirley dedication. Do you want to mention her Hebrew name? I don't know her.
Yes. Let me. Okay, so it's called. Her name is Yehudas Bas Nachum. Yehudas Bas Nachum. Okay, for the dedication. Okay, so I'm in the car. I can't really read anything. We're just dedicated anyway. I don't want to.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to share an idea or two with us, anybody, before we start the Gemara?
Okay, yes. Okay, actually, I can share an idea from the Parsha.
Okay.
The Parsha of this week is actually my brother's Bavli. It's called Ra'eh. Okay. And it talks about the kosher animals. I won't talk too much, too loud. Kosher animals, animals that we're allowed to eat. So one of the animals we're not allowed to eat is one of the birds is called a chassidah. Chassidah is a stork. And the reason why chassidah is forbidden for us to eat, not that I don't think you can't even, in this day and age, I don't think it's available anyway, is because it only looks after its own. It actually has selfish characteristics, the midah of selfishness and not inclusivity. So that's the reason why it's forbidden to. It's considered as a treif animal, the stork.
Okay.
It only looks after its own.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. All right, so we want to finish a few minutes early so you can obviously go to prayers. Arthur, your screen is clean by now. You've rubbed it for like 10 minutes. It's fine. All right.
You put me on mute if you want, and you can talk if you want.
Okay. So, guys, obviously the first thing that we covered was Nezek Shalom, full damages. Then we covered the aspect of pain, sorrow, and now we're dealing with the third issue, that one is paid in assault case if a person injures another person. Well, assault is probably the more accurate way. Injures implies accidental, is the aspect of healing. So the Gemara obviously elaborates in the Bryce and says, look, if sores developed on the victim because of the wound, or if the wound healed and returned, the assailant is obligated to heal him with the sores as well that have developed as a result. And in addition, is obligated to give him the cost of his loss of employment for the time that he has needed to recover because of the injuries. And working would have added to complications arising. But, however, if there was a court case already before the wounds were open to sepsis or infection, etc., and the court had determined the amount to be paid by the assailant to the victim, that's the amount we stick with. But if the assessment hadn't been made by the court at that point, any resurfacing of wounds that were originally caused by the assailant due to infection, etc., or bodily complications is also taken into account. Both the loss of employment time that is needed in addition to the actual initial injury, as well as the obligation to heal on an ongoing basis if the cause of those injuries were initially from the assailant. But if the sores developed not because of the wound, but for some other reason, for example, the victim didn't take care of his injuries and infection set in, or he was negligent in some manner, obviously the assailant has a certain cap order of what he's expected to pay and is not obligated to heal him past the point of the initial injury if the victim is to blame for the lack of healing due to negligence. Okay. And obviously, in that case, if the loss of employment is exacerbated by the victim's cause of infection, etc., the loss of employment only had to be paid for the initial stage, but not due to any negligence on the part of the victim. Now, Rav Yehuda's got a different opinion, and he said even if the sores develop because of the wound, the assailant is obligated to heal him, but he's not obligated to give the victim the cost of his loss of his employment due to these sores. So we're not talking about that shevet, that recovery time that's needed initially, but for the slightly extended periods where the wound got out of control. The sages have a different opinion to Rav Yehuda, because Rav Yehuda said, yes, there is an obligation to heal, but not an obligation to pay for loss of employment past that point. And the sages say that there's a scriptural link in the Chumash between the loss of employment and the healing. And how do we know this? Because it says in Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 19, it uses the word, only for his loss of employment shall he pay, and he shall provide for healing. So basically, by juxtaposing the payments for unemployment and healing, in the Chumash, it makes them interdependent. So if you're sorting out for the one, you're obligated for the other. So as far as the rabbis are concerned, his loss of employment and his healing is tied in together. And at the end of the day, anyone who is obligated for loss of employment is obligated for the healing. And anyone who is not obligated for the loss of employment is not obligated for the healing. So if sores develop because of the wound, the assailant isn't liable for either payment past a certain point, especially if the victim was negligent in his own health care, because he's not liable for loss of employment, meaning the two areas of healing and loss of employment are joined together, according to the sages, not Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So far there's three opinions. Okay, just to summarize, the Bava Kamma holds that the assailant is liable for both healing and loss of income, even if to a certain extent the wound continued past the normal date. But the reason why the Bava Kamma holds the assailant liable is because at the end of the day, he started this whole process. When he assaulted the victim, he started it. So although it might have been exacerbated by the victim's lack of care, there wouldn't have been an injury to start with or loss of income if the assailant hadn't struck him. Rav Yehuda holds that the assailant is liable for healing, but not for loss of income. But the sages, which by the way is generally the opinion of the Bava Kamma, but here it's slightly different. There are two groups of sages. The other group of sages hold that the assailant is not liable for either payment when the victim himself has been negligent in his own care. Okay, so basically, we want to say in a three-way dispute, on what point do they disagree? So the Gemara says, look, Rabbah says, once I found the rabbinical students in the Academy of Rav sitting and pondering this very question, and they said, here they disagree on whether permission for bandaging a wound is given, since that could cause the sores to develop. So what happens is we've got a little bit of an issue here, and that issue from Rashi is saying, look, you're going to have two extremes. If you don't bandage the wound, exposure to the cold, especially in the northern hemisphere, is going to cause the wound to hurt, especially in winter. But on the other hand, if you bandage the sores, if you bandage the wound, you could create a lot of heat and inflammation and infection, and then sores could develop and pus as a result. So do you have the pain, or do you want to keep the wound at least reasonably clean by covering it and not exposing it to cold? So given those circumstances, there's a question in the Gemara whether the victim is allowed to bandage the injury for his comfort, and thereby maybe creating the possibility of sores. It's not a foregone conclusion, but it could erupt. The rabbis, in other words, the Bava Kamma, the majority of rabbis, hold that the permission is given for bandaging a wound to prevent pain and to stop infection. But accordingly, if sores develop as a result of the bandaging, the assailant must pay for healing them. Why? And he must pay for loss of employment, because it was the assailant that inflicted the wound in the first place. Rav Yehuda holds that permission isn't given for bandaging a wound, because the victim must do what he can to heal and not aggravate it. In other words, since the victim bandaged the wound for his own comfort, the assailant should by rights bear no financial responsibility for any resulting sores. In other words, according to certain opinions, the initial pain factor that the assailant has to pay is only for the initial injury that the victim experienced at the time of the assault, but not for ongoing pain that the wound has caused. So since he's paid for that, and since in this particular case, bandaging the wound has aggravated the situation. The rabbis and the Tana Kamma hold that, Rav Yehuda holds that you certainly have to pay for bandaging the wound, but certainly not for the recovery as far as that's concerned. Okay. Now, why not? Because as we learned that he doesn't hold that the Chumash links the recovery of the wound to the healing aspect. Why? Because it says in the verse, let me just get the exact verse out of the Chumash. It says, Verafu Verefa, which means literally, and he shall heal. So the repetition indicates that that it's assigned for the aggressor to heal the wound, even if it reoccurs, in the case even where we think he would be exempt. However, because it doubled the word healing, it means a reoccurring of the wound, but it doesn't use that verse for his loss of employment the second time around. In other words, there's a small amount of time the assailant has to pay for his recuperation, but not beyond that point, especially if there's negligence. That's how Rav Yehuda reads it. Now, Rabbah holds slightly differently because he recounts his response to the students of Rav. And he said, Rabbah said, and I said to them, if permission is not given for bandaging a wound, the assailant would not be obligated also for the healing. Okay, because it's unreasonable for anybody to hold the assailant liable for sores caused by the victim's unauthorized action. That's according to Rabbah. So rather, we must say it's the opinion of everyone that permission is given for bandaging a wound, but it's not given for excessive bandaging, meaning that the Meiri explains that excessive bandaging means that you either wrap the wound too tightly, at which you cut off circulation, or alternatively, you're bandaging more of the affected limb than necessary, and that increases the heat inside, and obviously the propensity for infection. So as long as you keep the wound generally clean, aerated, and bandage enough so that it doesn't get infected and protects it from the cold, that's not considered excessive. So Rav Yehuda holds that since permission is not given for excessive bandaging, only regarding the payment for healing, which the verse repeated, is the assailant liable. But because regarding the payment of loss of employment, which in fact the verse excluded because it uses the term only, it means that for additional loss of employment, there is no liability. Again, the rabbis, the Tana Kamma holds that the verse repeated the payment for healing and also got obligated for loss of employment. So they say there's a dint of the pasuk being linked, and the juxtaposition means you're liable for both. Now, the Gemara just explains why Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And the primary reason is, he said, because the merciful one excluded it by stating the word only with reference to it. In other words, it says, only for his lost employment shall he pay. That's what the pasuk says. So only is a exclusionary word, and it said that the liability is only for the initial injury. Okay, that's how Rav Yehuda learns it. And what does the Tana Kamma do with the word only? In other words, there's obviously a reason that they use the word. So the rabbis and the Tana Kamma hold that it's for excluding sores that did not develop because of the wound, that the word only comes. Meaning that if the victim disobeyed his doctor's orders in ways or out of the parameters of what was instructed, you can't expect the assailant to be liable in that particular case. But if it comes within normal use, the assailant is liable for both loss of employment and healing. Now, there's a third opinion. It's a different rabbinical opinion, but there's a lot of rabbis that hold by the other, which says that anyone who's obligated for loss of employment is obligated for healing, and anyone who's not obligated for loss of employment is not obligated for healing. So why do I need the mention of the extra word healing? In other words, what's the point of it? Because it mentions the word healing twice. If you want to say that there's a juxtaposition between healing and recuperation, why mention the healing twice? So the sages hold that the saillant is not obligated for healing, even if the sores develop because of excessive bandaging. Okay, so why do we need that extra word healing? It's needed because a ton of Rav Yishmael's academy taught, for it was taught in a brisa. A sage of Rav Yishmael's academy said, the Torah said, and heal, he shall heal. From here we derive that permission is given for a possession that you can hire a doctor to heal the wound. So what are we actually talking about there, guys? Is this was actually, there was a book by the Rambam's son. Now, the Rambam was the minister of health in Egypt, and his son took over as minister of health. And he wrote a book on the way of Hashem. And he said, like, there is a school of thought that thinks that if Hashem gave a person a disease, you would think that a person, that might be a divine, what do you call it, punishment, or the divine will, that a person suffer from such a disease. So how do we know that man can't interfere? So the first expression of the word to heal him teaches that if an injury occurs as a result of another person assaulting him, he can intervene and heal himself with the aid of doctors. But the fact that it mentions heal and he shall heal, and mentions the word about healing and refuah twice, actually teaches that if illness comes directly to a person, in other words, not from assault, but through what do you call it, disease or some genetic condition, that he has to heal it and use doctors at his disposal. Because there was a school of thought, especially in the Middle Ages, that thought that interfering in God's will could be seen as a brazen nullification of the divine decree. So what it's teaching there is, if we've got the technology and the resources to heal a person, even if it seems as though it's a natural course of events that somebody should die or get very sick from this condition, that person has to intervene. So in conclusion, the three Tanaim of the Brisa argue in the case of excessive bandaging, which all hold are prohibited, because at the end of the day, the victim has got a duty to take care of himself as per the doctor's instruction and not aggravate his injuries with infection. So all the disputants take note that the two payment categories of healing and loss of employment are juxtaposed in one verse. So the way that Tana Kamma interprets this is saying, just as the assailant is liable for healing, he's also liable for loss of employment. According to Rav Yehuda, there's an exclusionary word only by the loss of employment. So he said that at the end of the day, the assailant doesn't have to pay for the loss of employment should infection set in again, but only for the rehealing with physicians of the victim, even if we were slightly negligent. And the sages, the other rabbinical school, not the Tana Kamma, hold that since the assailant is not liable for loss of employment, he's also not liable for healing at the point where the victim needs to take responsibility for the excess of bandaging, and he's not responsible for either. Okay, so far we're just going to take a break for a minute. I just wanted to know if it all makes sense to you guys. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, so what I learned, and
yeah, I'm listening, mate.
Nezek and Shevet, which is quite interesting because sometimes you don't realize the difference. Nezek can be used for anything that is devalued permanently, and it can be inanimate or physical or human. Doesn't make a difference, right? Where Shevet is just unemployment for the time, like let's say you're off for 2-3 months. Okay, and that's normally done to, you pay on that according to even like a watchman. Okay, for those 2-3 months. And how they work out with a guy, let's say you hurt a guy permanently, right? You chop off his hand, right?
Yes.
I don't know if we're there yet, maybe I'm skipping ahead. How they work out the difference is they work out, let's say it was a tailor, because you know, it's Rabbi Cohen, and you would have to say, I'm going to hire him for the next 20 years as a tailor. He's a 20-year-old guy, and I'm going to hire him for $100,000. Okay, but what would he have made as a shevet? Okay, it would be, let's say, 10,000. So the nezek would be 90,000, and the shevet would be 10,000.
Makes sense, because it's work on it's worked on what he would be worth as an employee.
Yes.
And that's why I far more prefer Rabbi Cohen's explanation than his value as a slave.
Yeah.
Makes much more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was very interesting that I've been studying on it, learning the word nezek and shevet. I've been memorizing it because I'm not
so you can remember the word shevet from the word Shabbat, recuperation. It's a resting period. It comes from the same root word. That's exactly it. Arthur, that's exactly it. Well done.
Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. It was good to know that. And another thing is, if it gets to a stage, let's say, for example, you chop off his leg, he can sit down. If he goes blind, he can listen. But if he goes deaf, yeah, you actually have to pay him 100% nezek because he can't do anything. It's considered a total, what's the name? A total.
So that's
wiper.
the only part that when I attended Rabbi Cohen's shiur live in Daf Yomi, when I heard that part of Bava Kamma, I said to him, it does bother me because I think it's far worse to be blind than deaf. Honestly, and the Torah holds it's worse to be deaf. So I don't quite get that, to be honest.
Yeah, I also don't. I've
never the reason why the reason why the deaf has a bigger problem is that maybe not so much today, but it's a communication block. I mean, even if you're blind, you can still answer a telephone. Okay.
And do something. You can't find the telephone.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. It rings, you pick it up. You can hear it. Did you never watch those superheroes that are blind and they can see superpowers? Well, that's basically what happens. You get heightened senses.
Yeah, only the comic book heroes when there's Ben Affleck. Okay. All right, let's go on a little bit. Arthur, you've done well, man. I appreciate that. You really have done your work. Really.
I just want to cheer it up for everybody. In a nutshell, what you're talking about.
Perfect. All right. Adina's in the background. Let me just finish a little bit. We're going to finish a bit early. So, all right. So, Arthur, I really appreciate that, by the way. So, listen, there's another brisa where the rabbis taught, from where do we know that if sores developed on the victim because of the wound, or if the wound healed, and then returned, that the assailant is obligated to heal him according to the general rabbinic opinion, including the sores that remanifest. And he's also obligated to give him the cost of his employment, because we said that the verse has a dint because they're juxtaposed next to each other, that when the minute you sort out healing, you have to sort out employment, because the Torah states, only for his lost employment shall he pay, and heal he shall heal. So it could be thought maybe that he's obligated even if the sores developed not because of the wound. In other words, that there's some other reason that the wound redevelops. We could think that in that case, the assailant should pay. So the Torah therefore stated at the beginning of the verse only, the word only as an exclusionary word, and guys, that precludes liability in that case. Okay. So what do we mean? Is that the Tana Kamma of the Brisa holds that the repetition of the word heal teaches that the assailant is liable for also the resultant sores that manifest again, and juxtaposes it to the loss of employment. Now, as far as so that was the Rabba view that came about. But however, Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda. Now, Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda is the son of Rabbi Yehuda. Says even if the sores develop because of the wound, the assailant is not liable, for it stated the word only, and the word only means that the assailant can't be totally liable for responsibility past the point at which the victim was negligent. So the Gemara asks, well, it says two explanations of Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda. So the one is that even if the sores redevelop because of the wound, the assailant is not liable, and he meant completely non-liable. In other words, in accordance with the view of the rabbis, if there's no linkage to the healing, there's no linkage to the recovery that he should pay for. And there are those rabbis that amended the statement and said even if the sores develop because of the wound, the assailant is not liable. He doesn't mean that he's not liable for the loss of employment, but he is obligated for the word healing because he holds like his father there, because his father said there's a double word for healing, which means even if the wound reoccurs, he concurs with his father Rav Yehuda in that brisa. So now the Gemara says there's a perplexing statement of the Tanna Kamma. It says, the master said it could be said that he's obligated even if the sores developed are not because of the wound. So the Torah states only to say that there's only a certain point of liability of the assailant. And the Gemara says that where the victim disobeyed the words or instructions of his doctors, there is no liability there, but it doesn't mean only in terms of the wound. It means in terms of his aftercare with regards to exercise and diet, etc. In other words, your peripheral mechanisms to heal. So it mentioned this was an incredibly interesting part. His doctor said to him, "You shall not eat honey or all types of sweets." And he ended up eating all these sweet foods because it says in the Gemara, honey and all types of sweets are harmful to a wound. And his wound developed a condition called gagusni. So what's gagusni? So I'll give you guys a clue that because you could think that for the fact that the victim cheated on his diet, that's not by him being negligent regarding the actual wound. So the assailant doesn't have to pay. It is negligence. So the Gemara says, what is gagusni? A buyer said dead flesh. So guys, I want to let you know, and it says, what is the cure? Aloe wax and resin found in wine barrels, and they presumably smeared on the affected area. So what does Arthur would know this? What does gagusni imply to you, Arthur? Arthur? Gavin, if I turn around to you and I say to you, one of the signs of diabetes is that wounds don't recover and heal correctly. Okay? In other words, if you knock up the blood sugar, that's what gagusni is, by the way. Is if you eat sweets and honey and your blood sugar goes up and you become what you call a pre-diabetic or a lifestyle diabetic, your recovery from injuries is significantly impaired. And the Gemara holds you liable for that. Now, that was quite interesting. There are two other manifestations of diabetes. The other one is glaucoma, and the other one is gangrene, which the Gemara describes as dead flesh. In the severe cases, gangrene sets in, and you have to have toes and other organs amputated, especially on extremities, and that's called diabetic neuropathy. But wound recovery is affected by diabetes. So that's what they called it, gagusni. I looked into it. So that was quite interesting. They had it even then. And in which case the assailant isn't liable. So the Gemara issued more rulings concerning the assailant's liability. Let's just go through this very quickly and then we almost done. So the assailant turns around to the victim and says, listen, I don't want to pay for a doctor because I'm a qualified doctor. And I can help heal you myself. And the victim can say to him, I don't want you to heal me because to me, you resemble a lion in ambush. What do we mean a lion in ambush? Because since the assailant was the one who struck the victim, this victim isn't going to have a lot of trust in the assailant's ability to heal him, even if he is a doctor, because he feels psychologically traumatized, as Gavin said yesterday, and that is taken to effect that he can refuse the assailant, even if he is a doctor, from healing him and ask the assailant to pay for another doctor. So Gavin, that does address your issue in terms of psychological trauma, just as a matter of interest. So if the assailant said to the victim, I will bring a doctor who will heal you for nothing, the victim can say to him, a doctor who heals for nothing is worth nothing. Meaning if you're going to get away with asking this doctor who owes you a favor to heal me, he's not going to put his heart into it nor his attention because he's not earning. So therefore, I don't believe I'm going to get the best medical care. Okay? And if the assailant said to the victim, I will bring a faraway doctor for you, the victim can say to him, as a faraway doctor can blind an eye. What do we mean a faraway doctor can blind an eye? It means in those days you couldn't go on Google Ads or get references in different provinces. A doctor was known as, another hint to you, Arthur, a doctor was known by his reputation, which means if he damaged a patient, word would get around town that he was a negligent doctor, or he wasn't very good, and it would sully his reputation and his ability to earn. So when the assailant wanted to bring a doctor out of town, even if he paid him for it, the victim could say, I don't want this doctor because if he botches up with me, he could bury his mistakes and it wouldn't affect his reputation. So I want a local doctor who the community knows, because if anything goes wrong, I will tell everybody that this doctor failed to heal me. So in fact, now the assailant has to listen to the victim in terms of his psychological needs as well. So if the victim said to the assailant, give me my money and I'll heal myself, because maybe he was a little bit short of cash, and he wanted a settlement, the doctor could also refuse, because he could say to him, listen, I don't believe that you'll spend the money on your healing. You'll be negligent with yourself, and you will need to take more money from me. It's going to end up in drama and in the court. So the victim then says to him, look, all right, then set a fixed amount for me, and we'll write in a contract I don't owe you anymore. The assailant can say to him, not a chance, because at the end of the day, you could still be negligent with yourself, and then people will call me a damaging ox. In other words, I will get a reputation of having bought you off and not cared about your well-being. But if the court ruled in the matter, they would assess what's fair with court-based doctors, and those doctors would say what your healing would really cost, and then I can make you a settlement. Because if I made you a settlement as far as that's concerned, the court approved, if you don't use the money to look after yourself, that's your problem. I could always turn around to the community and say, listen, the court assessed with professional doctors what he needed. I gave it to him. He blew it on one woman and song. It's not my problem. But I don't want to do it without court interference, because it's going to affect my reputation. So, guys, we're going to end off on that note. It seemed a lot of detail, and we're going to go to a liability for multiple payments tomorrow. I wanted to end early so that... Yeah.
Before you finish, I love your wording about the out-of-town doctor. If he messes up, he can bury his mistake. What did you say?
Did I say that?
Yeah.
I was thinking it. I didn't realize I actually said it. Yeah. Maybe that was a bit harsh. Maybe that was a bit harsh.
That would be a right term.
Gav, did you have a chance to Damon Mincha?
No, I have to do a double now.
All right. No, but you still got time to Damon Mincha. Let's end now, guys. Yeah.
Yes, I do have time.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
I'm going to do it now.
Damon.
Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.